heat in Adelaide does not just warm the skin, it cooks the marrow. It is a dry, oppressive force that turns the soil into red dust and the mind into a fever dream. But the heat of the 26th of January, 1966, was nothing compared to the cold that would follow a chill that would settle into the bones of an entire nation and never leave. Detective Inspector Elias Thorne sat in a room that smelled of stale tobacco, cheap bourbon, and the rotting paper of unsolved case files. He was a man carved from granite and regret. His face a roadmap of sleepless nights and horrific sights. Thorne was not merely a detective, he was a tombkeeper. At 65, with a liver screaming for mercy and a heart that had calcified long ago, he was the last guardian of the Beaumont file. He was a man of shadows, preferring the company of the dead to the living. His eyes, once sharp and blue, were now clouded with the grey film of cynicism, haunted by the spectres of children he had never met but knew better than his own estranged daughter. "It's the silence that kills you," Thorne whispered to the empty room, his voice a gravelly rasp. He lit another cigarette, the smoke curling around the black and white photograph pinned to the corkboard. 3 faces stared back at him. Jane, aged 9, Arnna, aged 7, and Grant, aged 4. They were smiling, frozen in a moment of eternal innocence, blissfully unaware that they were about to become the faces of Australia's darkest nightmare. Jane, the responsible eldest, with her shy smile and protective gaze. Arnna, the spirited middle child. Grant, the baby, trusting and small. They were the Beaumont Children. And on that scorching Australia day, they had packed their towels, taken a bus to Glenelg Beach, and walked straight into the abyss. This was not just a missing persons case. This was the moment the door to hell swung open in the city of churches. Before this, people left their back doors unlocked. They let their children roam the suburbs until the streetlights flickered on. After this, the locks were changed, the curtains were drawn, and every stranger became a monster. Thorne traced the edge of the photograph. He could almost hear the sound of the waves crashing against the jetty, a rhythmic pounding that sounded suspiciously like a clock ticking down to 0. The atmosphere in 1966 was festive, a celebration of national pride, but looking back through the lens of time, Thorne saw only the backdrop of a sacrificial altar. The sun was too bright, the shadows too long, and the water was too deep. Glenelg Beach, 10 a.m. The air shimmered above the asphalt. The Beaumont children, dressed in their swimwear, boarded the bus near their home on Harding Street, Somerton Park. It was a 5-minute ride to destiny. Jim and Nancy Beaumont, their parents, waved them off. It was a simple goodbye, a mundane gesture of parenting that would later be replayed in their minds a million times, analyzed for a tremor of premonition that wasn't there. If only they had held on a second longer. If only the bus had been late. If only. The beach was a tapestry of bodies, umbrellas, and the scent of coconut oil and fish and chips. The children found their spot on the lawn near the beach. Thorne read the witness statements for the 1,000th time, his stomach churning with the familiarity of the horror. At around 11 a.m., they were seen. Not alone. They were playing in the sprinklers, their laughter cutting through the drone of the cicadas. But there was a shadow falling over them. A man. The descriptions were consistent enough to be terrifying, yet vague enough to be useless. He was tall, thin, with an athletic build, tanned skin, receding sandy hair, mid-30s. He wore swimming trunks. He was lying on the grass watching them, predatory patience. Witnesses saw the children playing with him. Grant, the 4-year-old, was seen giggling as the man tossed him in the air. Jane was seen talking to him, her posture relaxed. This was the most chilling detail for Thorne, the trust. The man had not dragged them screaming into a van. He had seduced them with kindness. He had charmed his way past the natural defenses of a child. One witness, a woman sat nearby, reported seeing the man help the children dress. He was intimate, familiar, dusting the sand off their legs. It was a violation disguised as care. The man was the Satchel Man. In some theories, though the satchel appeared in different contexts. Here, he was just the stranger, a phantom in the sunlight. At 12:15 p.m., Jane bought pastries and a meat pie from Wenzel's Bakery. She paid with a £1 note. Thorne circled this detail in red ink. Nancy Beaumont had only given them coins. The man had given her the money. It was a transaction, a down payment on their lives. The last confirmed sighting was at 3 p.m. They were seen walking away from the beach in the general direction of their home, but accompanied by the man. He carried their towels. They walked in a cluster, the man seemingly guiding them. They were not running, they were not crying, they were simply evaporating. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, and the ocean turned a dark, unforgiving grey. The stage was set for the long night. The transition from concern to panic is a slow, suffocating chemical reaction. Jim Beaumont arrived home from work at 3 p.m. The house was empty. Silence is heavy in a house meant for children. It presses against the eardrums. He waited. Nancy had gone to visit a friend, assuming the children would walk home or catch the bus. When she returned at 5 p.m. and the house was still silent, the first cold finger of dread touched their spines. They drove to the beach. The sun was low, casting long skeletal shadows across the sand. The crowds were thinning. The seagulls were screaming, fighting over scraps of food, sounding like mocking laughter. Jim and Nancy scanned the horizon, calling out names that were usually answered with giggles and thundering footsteps. Jane, Arnna, Grant. The wind snatched the names away, carrying them out to the cold southern ocean. 7:30 p.m. They walked into the Glenelg police station. The desk sergeant looked up, expecting a noise complaint or a lost wallet. Instead, he saw two parents with hollow eyes, their souls already beginning to fracture. The police search began immediately, but in 1966, the protocols for abduction were different. There was an assumption of mischief, of children losing track of time. But Thorne knew, looking back, that the clock had already run out. The golden hour was gone. By nightfall, the beach was a swarm of flashlights, looking like fireflies in a graveyard. Officers combed the dunes, the jetty, the storm drains. They found nothing. No towels, no shoes, no clothes. It was as if the earth had simply opened its maw, swallowed them whole, and sealed itself shut without leaving a scar. Thorne poured another drink, his hand trembling slightly. The terror of that night was specific. It was the terror of the unknown. The parent sat by the telephone, praying for it to ring, yet terrified of what the voice on the other end might say. Every creak of the floorboards was a hope. Every gust of wind against the window was a taunt. The media descended like vultures. The faces of the three children were plastered on every television screen, every newspaper, front page. They became Australia's children. But ownership implies protection, and Australia had failed to protect them. The sketches of the suspect were released. A face that would haunt the nightmares of a generation. A sharp nose, a high forehead, eyes that seemed to look right through you, A face of generic evil, yet specifically terrifying, because he looked like anyone. He looked like a neighbor, a teacher, a father. Desperation breeds madness. As the days turned into weeks and the leads dried up like blood in the sun, the investigation took a turn into the bizarre and the macabre. Thorne flipped the page to the chapter on Gerard Croizet, the Dutch parapsychologist, a psychic. In a world of facts and forensics, turning to a clairvoyant was an admission of defeat, a signal that the police were chasing ghosts. Croizet arrived in Australia with the fanfare of a prophet. He claimed to see visions. He described a warehouse. He described a freshly laid concrete floor. He described the bodies of the children buried beneath it. The media frenzy was intoxicating. The public, desperate for closure, clung to his words as gospel. A warehouse was identified. The public raised money to excavate it. Thorne grimaced at the memory of the footage, men with jackhammers tearing into the concrete, their faces masks of grim determination. They dug, and they dug. The dust choked the air. The noise was deafening. Jim and Nancy Beaumont waited, their hearts suspended in a state of agonizing limbo. Was this it? Was this the tomb of their children? The excavators went deeper, sifting through the soil, looking for bone, for cloth, for anything. They found nothing. Just dirt, debris. The psychic had been wrong, or the spirits had lied, or perhaps the evil was just too deep for even a psychic to see. The disappointment was a physical blow. It crushed the remaining shards of hope the parents held. The ridicule that followed was bitter, but the pain was worse. It was a circus, and the Beaumonts were the tragic sideshow. Thorne looked at the photos of the excavation site, a gaping wound in the ground that yielded no secrets. It was a metaphor for the entire case, a deep, dark hole that led nowhere. Meanwhile, the hoax letters began. Vile, cruel letters sent to the parents, claiming to know where the children were, demanding money, or simply describing their suffering. Thorne's fists clenched. There is a special circle in hell for those who prey on the grieving. The police chased every lead, every shadow. They drained the Patawalonga boat haven. They searched the sand dunes until every grain of sand had been turned, but the children remained elusive, existing only in the past tense, fading like an old photograph left in the sun. A case this cold does not lack suspects. It suffers from too many monsters. Thorne reviewed the gallery of rogues, each more disturbing than the last. This was the era before the term serial killer was in common parlance, but the behavior was ancient. First, there was Harry Phipps, a wealthy local factory owner, a charismatic man, a predator. Years later, his own son would come forward with claims of abuse, of children being brought to the factory, of digging a hole in the backyard on that very weekend. Thorne studied Phipps's face in the dossier. Smug, entitled, the type of man who believed his money could buy silence. Witnesses placed a man resembling Phipps at the beach. But by the time the dots were connected, Phipps was dead, his secrets rotting with him. Digs at his former property yielded nothing but anomalies in the soil, disturbed earth, but no bodies. Had they been moved, or was it another dead end? Then there was the shadow of Bevan Spencer von Einem. Though his known crimes, the abduction and murder of young men, occurred later, the modus operandi of the family chilled Thorne to the bone. A group of high society deviants, preying on the vulnerable, operating with surgical precision. Could the Beaumonts have been an early experiment, a practice run for a cult of depravity? The police had looked into connections. whispered rumors of a pedophile ring operating in Adelaide's upper echelons. Doctors, lawyers, judges. The Saturn Man. The darkness in Adelaide wasn't in the back alleys. It was in the boardrooms and the mansions. Thorne shivered. The profile of the abductor was that of a sexual sadist. Someone who derived pleasure not just from the act, but from the possession. The children weren't just killed, they were kept. For how long? Hours? Days? The thought was a razor blade in Thorne's mind. The police sketches of the suspect, the high cheekbones, the thin build, stared back at him. It was a face that could disappear into a crowd, a face that could be smiling at you from the next table. The horror wasn't a supernatural demon. It was the banality of a human being who had shed his humanity. The case exposed the underbelly of Australian society. It revealed that beneath the sun-drenched exterior, there were currents of filth and violence. The sheer number of potential suspects, Arthur Stanley Brown, Derek Percy, proved that the world was far more dangerous than anyone in 1966 wanted to believe. The Beaumont children had walked into a trap set by a spider that had been waiting for a long, long time. Decades are not measured in time for the parents of missing children. They are measured in breaths taken in pain. The 1,970 seconds passed, then the 80 seconds, the 90 seconds. The world changed. Man walked on the moon. Wars began and ended. The internet connected the globe. But in a small house in Somerton Park, time had stopped at 3 p.m. on the 26th of January, 1966. Jim and Nancy Beaumont stayed in that house. They never moved. They never changed their phone number. Why? Because time's what if asterisks. What if Jane escaped and called? What if Grant, now a grown man, remembered a number from his childhood? They lived in a mausoleum of hope. They kept the children's rooms exactly as they were, museums of lost childhood. The teddy bears gathering dust, the beds made, the clothes folded. It was a shrine to the living dead. Thorne felt a profound sorrow for Nancy Beaumont. A mother's grief is a primal wound that never heals. She withered away, her spirit eroding with every false lead and every anniversary. She died in 2019, 92 years old. She died without knowing. She crossed into the afterlife, not knowing if her babies had cried for her, if they had suffered, or where their bones lay. It was the ultimate tragedy. The cruelty of the universe was not just in the abduction, but in the silence that followed. Jim Beaumont, now alone, remained a figure of stoic devastation. He was the last watchman. The sketches of the suspect had aged just as the children would have. Computer-generated images showed what Jane, Arnna, and Grant might look like as adults. But these were ghostly fabrications. The reality was frozen in 1966. The cultural impact was permanent. The Beaumont children became a cautionary tale whispered to every Australian child. Don't talk to strangers. Stay where I can see you. The innocence of the beach holiday was murdered. The ocean, once a playground, became a boundary of fear. Thorne knew that every detective in South Australia carried a piece of this case in their heart, a heavy stone of failure. They had sketches, they had profiles, they had millions of dollars in rewards, but they didn't have the one thing that mattered, the truth. Thorne closed the file. The sun was rising outside his office window, a pale, sickly light filtering through the blinds. Another day where the Beaumont children were still missing. The case was technically active, but it was cold as the grave. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city of Adelaide. It was a beautiful city, surrounded by parklands, bordered by the sea. but to Thorne, it was a graveyard. Somewhere out there, under a factory floor, beneath a suburban patio, or deep in the dunes of a coastal scrub, lay the remains of 3 children. They were part of the geology now. The man who took them, the stranger, the satchel man, the monster, was likely dead. He had won. He had taken his secret to the void, cheating justice. There would be no handcuffs, no trial, no verdict. Just the eternal question mark. Thorne thought of the ocean at Glenelg, the waves erasing the footprints in the sand. That was the horror of it all. The world keeps turning, the tides keep coming in and out. The laughter of new children fills the air at the beach, oblivious to the ghosts that walk among them. "Day doet en bai thung." The Vietnamese phrase floated into his mind, a remnant of an old case partner. Torment and tragedy, lingering pain. That was the only legacy left. The Beaumont case wasn't a puzzle to be solved anymore. It was a scar on the face of humanity. Thorne turned off the light, leaving the room in darkness, save for the 3 smiling faces on the wall, forever young, forever waiting, forever lost. The silence of the room was heavy, filled with the unspoken screams of the past. He walked out, closing the door on the dead, but knowing they would follow him home. They always did. Somewhere, the wind blew over Glenelg Beach, whispering names that no one answered.